Well, I'm going to conclude this series on the question of, is it acceptable for Christians to drink alcoholic beverages, at least in moderation? Now, last week, I talked about what some consider to be the strongest argument in favor of drinking in moderation, and that is the absence of any scripture that specifically or categorically condemns or prohibits drinking in moderation. And that's a good point. You won't find a verse that says, thou shalt not, or it is a sin to drink any amount of an alcoholic beverage. But I mentioned last week there's a noticeable caveat with that point. And that is, by some estimations, if God had said that drinking any amount of alcohol is sinful, is wrong, that may have led to the premature deaths maybe 50% of early New Testament Christians, for two reasons. Number one, because many of them, in certain locations, certain times of the year, had nothing else they could safely drink, but at least some of the weaker wines. It did contain some alcohol. Because the water, as I mentioned last week, it wasn't always hard to find water, but it was frequently hard to find safe drinking water. And that's still the case in many areas of the Middle East, as we say. So they had to drink some just to survive. But not only that, these weaker wines were often used for medicinal purposes to help with different ailments, because they didn't have our medications, obviously, that we have today. Remember, Paul told Timothy to no longer drink just water, only water, but have a little wine too, for your stomach's sake, for your constant infirmities. 1 Timothy 5, verse 23. The point is, not only had God forbidden any alcoholic intake with any even weak wine, that many Christians would have died of disease from the parasites and bacteria they would have had just to drink regular water available at that time, but also those with certain diseases would have languished. And Timothy certainly would not have had the strength to go around and travel and preach the gospel had it not been for that. So, is that the only reason that God did not categorically condemn drinking, say, in moderation? Well, only God could say that. I can't say that, but who can deny the possible consequences or ramifications had God made such a prohibition against drinking any amount of alcohol? All right. Well, I also noticed last week, or added, a crucial consideration for Christians when it comes to the subject of drinking in moderation. And that's our example. Our example. And I don't think I can emphasize that. I mean, like it or not, God holds us to a high standard. I'm afraid with the ways of the world, sometimes we've let God down in that regard. And I'm not just talking about the subject of drinking, but in other ways as well. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, for instance, Peter said, but you are a chosen generation. He's speaking to Christians and us, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Holy means to be set apart for spiritual use. His own special people. Special people. That word means unique, different from the norm. That you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That way of living in such a way that the world can see a big difference. Not just a little difference, but a big difference between us and those in the world. They will need to see that if they're even going to be, if the light of Jesus Christ, the Christian life, will even appeal to them. If we're the same as them, or basically the same, I mean, so what? They might think. Also, Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 11, said, beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul. Well, we understand that, right? But then he says, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles. Honorable means upright, upstanding, respectable. That when they speak against you as evildoers, when they just suspect that you must be doing something wrong, they may by your good works, when they investigate, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. You know, Christians have been accused from almost day one of various assorted lifestyles. Many, because it was a custom for early Christians to kiss one another on the cheek. Many just assumed that Christians were homosexuals. But then when they would investigate and find out the reason for that, they found out they were totally wrong. And some, doing further investigation of the holiness, the holy life of Christians, actually turned to Jesus Christ as a result, and that's what Peter is trying to say. But someone might say, well, does drinking in moderation necessarily make me a bad example? You remember last week the illustration I concluded with, going back over 40 years, nearly 45 years, to the conversation I had with a deacon from the Putnam City Church of Christ in Oklahoma City. Many of you remember that. If you weren't here, let me just remind you. So I'm talking with this gentleman. We were working together, so we were taking a little lunch break, and he just said, I just need to ask you something. He said, every year, the company has this 4th of July picnic, and I always attend. And he said, they offer ice cold beer, all sorts of different beers there. So he said, I normally never touch alcohol, but at that picnic, it's normally hot, 4th of July in Oklahoma. So he said, I typically have 2, maybe 3 cans of beer. But he said, that's the only time. And then he said, you don't see anything wrong with that, do you? And I thought a few moments. And then I asked him this question. I said, now tell me, does anybody at that picnic, are they aware that you are a Christian, a member of the Lord's church, and a deacon? He never answered that question. Okay? But he did think about it. And finally, the only thing he said, 5 words. He said, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. So what was going on in his mind? I would suppose he was thinking now, would I be proud to tell someone at the picnic, by the way, I'm a Christian. I'm a member of the Church of Christ, and I'm a deacon, as he's opening that next can of beer, taking a big sip from it? I think that would be problematic, and he realized it. No, I don't have no idea if he continued to do that at that picnic. I wasn't telling him not to attend the picnic, but I think the point was well made. Now, I want to give you 3 other real-life illustrations, or examples, that I think illustrate the importance of our example. Number 1, my parents. I never saw my parents drunk, although I think I mentioned in one previous lesson that on Saturdays, sometimes Sunday afternoons, this is before they obeyed the gospel, my Uncle Tom and my father would be watching a baseball, maybe football game, and they would have a six-pack, at least one, 6-pack of beer, and they'd be drinking that, and we wouldn't be close to the living room or whatever when they were doing that, but we would just hear their laughter get louder and louder, so we knew something definitely was going on besides just watching the game. Well, let me tell you, I can't say for sure. I think it was about 3 months after we obeyed the gospel at the Adrian Church of Christ. Lester Allen, the preacher at that time, baptized my family. After the morning service, we went to kind of like a convenience store today. And my father would frequently go in, and among some groceries, he would buy some beer and maybe some wine. Well, that day was different because before, and we kids, we'd go in there hoping, they'd let us get some candy. But before anybody left the car, my parents had this very serious discussion initiated by my mother. And she says something to this effect. She said, now, Albert, my father, and I think Lester Allen had just preached a sermon on the importance of example, being an example, Christian example to our children, for us parents. Because she said, Albert, I just don't think it's right that we buy this beer or wine and drink this in front of the kids. She said, I think that's being a bad example. In fact, she said, I'm very confident that it is. And my father didn't argue. He agreed. They didn't purchase any beer or wine that day. To my knowledge, they never did again. But once, or even beyond that, they were members of the Adrian Eagles Club. Now, they would frequently go out, especially on Saturday nights. The Eagles Club would have a dance, which drinking was a part of that, and they would also have other like activities during holidays, and drinking would always be involved. During that same conversation in which they decided they'd not go in and buy beer or wine, they made the decision that they were going to let their membership in the Eagles Club expire and no longer attend, because when they did go to those activities, they would also drink. And sometimes when they came home, I'm not saying they ever came home drunk, but I think we would notice by their breath that they had been drinking. So They just decided, in order to be the best example for us children, they would no longer drink any alcohol beverage. One thing I remember from that conversation in the car, I was impressed. And I thought, wow, they're taking this Christian thing seriously. Okay? Example number 2. When I was active in the Rotary, especially in the 80s, when I was preacher at the Garden City Church of Christ, members of the Rotary at our meetings, weekly meetings, would frequently receive these advertisements, flyers that would advertise upcoming events, activities in which alcoholic beverages were not only served, but that was kind of the specialty. That was a draw, for a lot of those Rotarians. But when these notices were circulated, it became more and more obvious to me that they almost invariably skipped me. They didn't give me any of those notices. And then I found out the reason. At first I thought they knew I was a preacher, and that's why they didn't do it. But come to find out that they knew I was not only a preacher, they knew I was a member of the Church of Christ. And previous experience, because a couple other members of the Rotary were members of the Garden City Church of Christ, those experiences taught them that members of the Church of Christ, for the vast majority, would not participate in activities in which drinking was featured or the big draw of those activities. And that made an impression on me. You see, there were, I won't mention the religious groups, there were representatives, shall we say, from other groups that did go to those activities. But members of the Church of Christ, they thought, no. As bad as, here's the bottom line with that. As bad as the world is today, it was pretty bad in the 80s. Yet many worldly people believed that true Christians and alcohol, even back then, did not mix. All right. The last example. I had a very interesting conversation with Brian Gerback. Brian Gerback is the superintendent of Milan Public Schools. During that conversation, we got talking about examples. And he talked about his example as the superintendent of Milan Public Schools. And I think I'm quoting him, at least this is very close to what he said. He said, and I didn't mention this, I didn't bring up the subject. He said, take drinking, for example. He says, now between us, he said, oh yeah, I drink. But I would never risk the possibility of drinking, in which maybe I could drink too much in Milan. In fact, he said, I would not even go to the local Kroger store and purchase a 6-pack or 2 of beer. Because he said, I have to set the highest possible example, not only before students, parents, staff, but others in the community that know that I'm superintendent of Milan Public School. I was fascinated by that remark. He felt the absolute need to protect his reputation in that position. Now, is there any connection with Christian example? Well, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we should say yes. Now, I could share more points on the subject. I listed, 11 in the bulletin article I did for this week. But I want to conclude the series with this thought. If we, like those in the days of the apostles, had no choice at times but to drink something that had some alcoholic content, say like weak wines. If we had no choice at times, and you could forget much of what I've said. In fact, you could forget practically everything I've said except that dealing with drunkenness. But that's the point. We do have choices. We have more non-alcoholic choices of beverages in the United States than 80%, at least I'm told, 80% of the world's population. But that's nothing compared to the infinitely more choices of non-alcoholic beverages we have, as the Christians did in the days of the apostles. We have a lot of choices. And I think that means something. I close with something the Apostle Paul said to the Romans, Paul was talking about the example that the mature Roman Christian should be setting, and the example that even he would try to set. Romans 14:21, he said, it is good to neither eat meat. Now he's talking about meat that had been purchased at a place, in fact, in Paul's day, especially in places like Rome, Athens, other cities, most of the meats that were sold in the meat market had been dedicated to some idol, some god or goddess, so to speak, in hopes that they could inflate the price slightly by saying, since this meat was offered to some idol, it would have more maybe supernatural properties. It might help you live longer. It might make you healthier. It might make your muscles grow a little faster for us vain men. Well, Paul said, and Paul talks about that, he said, if I go and buy some of this meat and people see me and they know that this meat was dedicated to an idol, Paul would in essence say, I know there's no such thing as idol. It wouldn't bother me, but it might just bother somebody who knows this meat was dedicated. So he said, it is good neither to eat meat. And then he adds this, nor drink wine. And he's talking about the alcoholic variety. Nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. Something to think about. If somebody needs to respond to the invitation, or several people, to obey the gospel, to confess Jesus, repent of sins, be baptized, buried with Christ in baptism, we'd love to help you tonight, if you're ready and willing. If tonight you need a prayer for any reason, please let us know, because we want to pray for you. If you need to, would you come as those who can stand and sing the song of invitation?